I had the pleasure of getting to know this brother, I guess, the first time I made Hajj, which was many, many moons ago. We met actually in Mecca, and he was studying at that time and continues to study the religion of Islam. Young brother, energetic brother, but I think one of the brothers that are more read than a lot of individuals that I run into. I always tell Abul-Hasan Maalik that he really is an attorney. It really was his calling, because you can ask him a question, and what he does is he will go to 5, 6, 7, sometimes 15, 20 reference points to answer the question. So if you ask a question, you have to be ready to sit down for a while to get the answer, and you get every avenue. So what we have in Islam, we have people that we call da'is, which are students of knowledge. And they are students that are actually individuals that are in quest for knowledge of understanding Islam and trying to understand it properly. And that's an important aspect. So we have, Malik right now is the imam at Camden Masjid, right across the bridge. Has been so for maybe a year and a half or so. And he just actually came back from teaching in Riyadh. Was it Riyadh? Teaching in Saudi Arabia. And he's with us for a short period of time, because he tells me he's going to leave us soon. But I couldn't think of a better individual to call when I knew that this subject matter was something that needed to be addressed, especially with the misinformation pushed out there. So this is my brother, someone that my companion, and someone that I think is very, very knowledgeable about this information that we're about to get. So if you do have some questions, I'm gonna tell you, the phone lines are gonna blow up. So
they've already blown up. So, they've already blown up.
Hold on to those questions, and let's try to address some of those matters soon. Without further ado.
Firstly, I thank Tariq for inviting me here today to speak on this particular subject. I think it's past due that we tried to shed some light on the subject of polygyny, which is the actual correct term. Polygamy is from the New Greek, or what it really means is plural marriage or multiple marriages. But more specifically, polygyny is when a man takes on multiple wives, as opposed to polyandry, which is when a woman takes on multiple husbands. Polygyny within itself is something that has been practiced historically throughout most of the nations and peoples of the past, excluding the Greco-Roman society. They were about the only society that we know of the past that didn't have this practice. But what the Greco-Romans did have was a concubinage. In other words, they would have one wife, but they would keep concubines, a number of mistresses and girlfriends and the likes of these matters, because it was a slave culture. They had a lot of slaves, so they would use these women to fulfill their sexual desires, but they would have no responsibility towards them. So what happened was, because the Greco-Roman society is actually the foundation of Western civilization, that when this spread throughout the earth and when the colonization took place of different nations in Africa and in Asia who were polygamous by their nature, or practiced polygyny by their nature, that when they were colonized by these particular peoples, they began to enforce their norms and their morals upon these individuals, and therefore made either polygamy either outlawed it outright, or they made it a hated thing altogether. With regards to plural marriage, as I just mentioned something of historically, again, Islam, or the Muslims, were not the first to practice polygyny. It was something that was well known amongst the peoples of the earth, until the point when the Prophet Muhammad, when he brought his revelation from Allah, when he brought the revelation, there were many companions at that time, those who were his companions, who had more than one wife. And to the point where there was one companion by the name of Ghilan, and Ghilan actually had 20 wives before he accepted Islam. When he accepted Islam, the Prophet had told him and commanded him that he had to divorce 16 of them and keep 4 of them. He had to keep 4 of them and divorce the rest of them. This was a proof that the scholars had mentioned that polygyny actually took place before Islam, before the revelation came to the Prophet Muhammad. It was a well-known practice amongst the people. So Ghilan had to divorce these 16 wives. Another important point that some of the scholars actually point to and show is that 4 was actually preferred to 1, because the Prophet didn't say divorce 19 and keep 1. He said divorce 16 and keep 4. So even in that society, it was known that the man who had multiple wives or more wives had more benefit with regards to his charity, with regards to children, having more children, the likes of these matters. So I don't know if we have time, but I wanted to kind of quickly go into some of the other religions, world religions, that actually practice polygyny. We have time?
Yeah.
Okay, firstly, in Judaism, there is a well-known history of polygyny in Judaism. And the Hebrews themselves, it was a very common practice amongst them. Hebrew scriptures document this very well. There's around 40 different polygamists that are mentioned in the Old Testament. From them, I just mentioned some of the prophets, which are in all of our traditions, Judeo-Christian, Islamic tradition. That would be Abraham, that would be Moses, Jacob, Esau, David, and as I mentioned, there are about 40 that I mentioned, but these are some of the major prophets that are well known, as we say, amongst many of the different religions. There are many verses in the Old Testament that actually talk about how polygamy was to be practiced and how it was to be regulated. In Exodus 21:10, it stipulates that multiple marriages are not to diminish the status of the first wife. In other words, yes, you can have multiple wives, but make sure that you don't, slight the first wife.
How do you do that, though? I'm sorry.
Oh, I might have to stand here. Marlon jumped out of seat on that one.
We're going to get to that. And one point that I want to talk about later is exactly what we just saw, emotions. We have to be careful about emotions in this matter, as emotions cannot take the place of centuries of history and centuries of tradition. Emotions are not enough, as we'll discuss hopefully in the coming hours. That emotion is not enough to negate that which has taken place over the history of mankind. Back to what we were saying, that in Deuteronomy 21:15 through 17, it talks about how a man must award the inheritance that is due to his firstborn son, whether it's even from a wife that he dislikes. So in other words, even if it's a wife that he doesn't like or he has some animosity towards, he still has to reward that child from that marriage, from that particular woman, no matter how he may feel about that wife, which shows us that there was definitely more than one wife. Amongst those prophets that we know, Solomon and David, who was mentioned that Solomon perhaps had 700 wives and a number of concubines, and David, it mentions, had as many wives as concubines. So there are many points in the Old Testament that show that polygamy was a well-known practice amongst even the patriarchs. Coming to Christianity, then Christianity did not refute or negate polygamy in any way. Rather, the early Christians actually followed in the tradition of the Hebrews. St. Augustine, who was a well-known theologian, he said, "Now indeed in our time, and in keeping with Roman custom, it is no longer allowed to take another wife." So as I had mentioned earlier, that it wasn't the religion of Christianity itself that had actually outlawed or eradicated polygyny, but rather it was that which was in keeping with Roman custom. Because when Paul was trying to make Christianity appealing to the Romans, he made many additions and subtractions from Christianity, to the point where there's a book that's called The 100 Most Influential Religious Leaders of History. The Prophet Muhammad was first. And the reason why they mention that Prophet Muhammad was first is because they say his message was the most clear and the most precise and the most complete. Paul was second and Jesus was third. When it was asked, well, why would Paul be second and Jesus third? They said because Paul had more to do with modern Christianity than Jesus ever did. So when Paul, who when he talked about marriage, as we know from those who have studied anything of the Bible, then we know that Paul was committed to being aesthetic, meaning that he tried to remove himself from sexual pleasures altogether. And he said it was better for a person to remain